And with that, welcome to the Stewardship Network's monthly webcast. My name is Rob Luzinski, and I'm the community coordinator at the Stewardship Network. I would first like to go through some introduction slides for you before we get into the main event. So first, a little bit about us. So the Stewardship Network is a 501c3 nonprofit organization with an award-winning 20-year history. We are now serving, I think that should be 20 plus place-based it is actually 30 plus place-based TSN member communities and fiscally sponsored projects, forgive me. 20 plus member communities, but 30 plus, including our fiscally sponsored projects across the Great Lakes and the country. We are so proud to be supporting all of these wonderful organizations in their work. And many of our programs, including this one, are available to everyone. Our mission, we exist to connect, equip, and mobilize nature's caretakers. So I'd like to dive a little bit deeper into the different aspects of our mission. So we connect knowledge we've collected from internal collaborations and from external partners, and we share it as widely as possible throughout our network. We equip, we remove a wide range of hurdles so that stewards can pour more energy into their ecosystems and their communities. And mobilize. In supporting our network and like-purpose partners, we amplify collaborative stewardship efforts here at home and nationwide. So digging a little bit deeper into our connect pillar here, we have one of our favorite times of year coming up in not too long with the Stewardship Network Conference. So we now have the full agenda online. We're very excited to share that with you. You can visit our site for a complete 2-day event agenda, and you can plan your experience, start jotting down which sessions you'd like to see, maybe which speakers you'd like to chat with or connect with while you're at the conference, and get a little preview of who you might expect to see at our conference. You can visit our speakers page to meet 100 plus of Stewardship's brightest minds. And we recommend that you register before November 30th because that is when our early bird discounts will end. And that is for all ticket types. So you could save a little bit of money if you know in advance that you are going to be joining us. Now, we did some wonderful work, and shout out to Bob Zamet, our communications director, for doing some great interviews during our conference last year. So now we'd like to get into video 2 of 3 in our conference testimonials series. So thank you to the TSN Conference 2025 attendees who helps us captured all of these anecdotes that you'll see in a moment. And also thank you to the Factory Creatives for helping us put it all together. We could not have done it without your help. A little bit of an overview of the series. We're looking at 3 reasons to attend in these videos. The first one was about knowledge, and this next one is about connection. And I think that you may recognize a few familiar faces within this video if you are a longtime member of the Stewardship Network.
These are my people. It is so refreshing to be at a conference that you are sharing the same values with the people around you and the same stories, and you can connect in that way, and it's just an amazing feeling.
I mean, there's great energy here. I come every year because these are my people. I get to share time with others that love the same things that I love.
It's a really good mix. Like, there's people here who I know, and I know those faces, see them all the time, good to talk to, but there's also a ton of people who I don't see very often and get to connect with.
Probably the number one thing I get out of it is talking to other land managers or other people doing invasive species stuff. It's just good to know that everyone's going through the same things.
When I said to folks this morning, how many people have met somebody new, have made a new connection? And everybody raised their hands.
So thank you again to everyone that was a part of that video. And I can attest that one of my favorite parts about the conference is connecting with all kinds of different people, often that I am only on email chains and video calls with. It is truly a special time, and I hope that you will join us for our next conference. So next, we'd like to talk a little bit more about different aspects of our mission. So we're thinking about equip and mobilize here. And let's tell you a little bit about our gloves program. It's one of our favorite programs that you may or may not have heard of. And it started as a very small kind of initiative, and now it's grown to incredible reach and impact across the country. So We have a little anecdote here from one of our supporters in Boy Blank Island, Michigan. And they are treating spotted gnatweed. And they would like to say thank you again for your generosity in making these gloves available to our volunteers. We appreciate all the time and energy that goes into this wonderful program. These gloves really made a difference for us. Thank you so much, Brandy, for sharing that anecdote with us. And we encourage you, if you have used the Gloves for Good program, please do share your stories and photos with us. It is such a wonderful way to celebrate the impact that this program is having. Next, we'd like to bring in the mobilize aspect and really kind of tying it all together to talk to you all and say, we cannot do this work without your help, right? So we are in the midst and in the beginning of our end of year campaign 2025. So we will be asking folks within our network to support the great work that we do. And really, you all make our work possible. So we encourage you to visit stewardshipnetwork.org/impact. In a year of sector-wide scarcity, we're doing all we can to step up and say yes as often as possible. As you saw with that 30+ number of member communities and fiscally sponsored projects, we are trying to help as many people on the ground as we possibly can. In light of it all, we have some longtime supporters that are offering to match up to $52,000 of your donations before the year ends on 12/31. So this is your opportunity to be a part of that match and to double your impact when you contribute to the Stewardship Network. You can check out our freshly updated impact page. Again, that is stewardshipnetwork.org/impact to learn more about our huge 2025 and how you can keep it going for 2026 and beyond. So thank you all in advance for considering making us a beneficiary of your donations this end of year season. And with that, I would like to move on to our special guest for today. So we have Mike Schuster, who is a researcher with the University of Minnesota. And today's talk will be about using plants to control buckthorn. So with that, Mike, if you'd like to join us on screen and go ahead and start sharing, that'd be great.
All right, look good?
Yes, I am seeing your screen.
Great.
That's great.
Excellent. There we go. Awesome. Well, thanks for having me. And yeah, so I'm Mike Schuster. I'm a researcher at the Department of Forest Resources at the University of Minnesota. I'm also an assistant professor at the biology department at Hamline University, which is just down the road. But the work I'm talking about today is something that's been done in or as part of this group that we call the Minnesota Invasive Terrestrial Plants and Pest Center. And that's a network that I'm guessing some of the people that are here today are familiar with. Maybe that's how they heard about the talk. But it's a big research center that does a lot of really fantastic work, not just on conservation, but in general invasive species issues in the state of Minnesota. And we've been really fortunate to be able to do almost a decade of work as part of what we call MITPIC. So before we get into any of the details today, I did want to point out, like, we do have a website. So, you know, if you ever have questions that pop up, you know, during the talk, tomorrow, whatever, you can always check out our website. It's coveredup.umn.edu. And a lot of the information that I'm going to be talking about today is presented there in some shape or form. So if you're curious about seed mixes or the different types of experiments we do or our partners or anything like that, it's all available on the website. So please check that out as an ongoing resource. We will be updating it over the winter here. And so that's also a place where you can see some of the new information as it becomes available. I also want to thank our extensive network of partners. You know, I'm the guy giving the talk here, but I'm not the one that you know, spend every day out in the field over the summer doing all the hard work, or the people that were generous enough to partner with us and help guide our project through the many years that we've been doing this. And so it's these partners that are really the people that are making it all happen. And I definitely want to thank them for their insight and willingness to contribute to this work. And so, yeah, we're talking about buckthorn management today. And in Minnesota, in Eastern North America, we have two species of invasive buckthorn. Glossy buckthorn is Frangula ulmus. Common buckthorn is Rhamnus cathartica. I'm primarily going to be talking about the latter of those two, common buckthorn. That's the species that we've used as our study subject for the most part. But there are a lot of similarities between these species, and a lot of the things that we'll be talking about applies to both, at least in some circumstances. So keep that in mind. If you're in a place that has more glossy buckthorn, a lot of this is still going to be applicable. And so the deal with these species is that they were both introduced in the 1800s primarily as hedge species or as ornamental plants, and they have tons of traits that make them very good at this. They grow very quickly, they produce very dense foliage. You can see some of these traits on display on this photo on the right. So this is a picture of me walking on what used to be a mown path, but has been taken over by buckthorn on either side. And so it's actually kind of, uncharacteristically easy to get through this compared to most buckthorn stands. But yeah, there's a lot of plant material there, right? And those plants hold their leaves really late into the fall or into winter, generally not losing them to senescence, but instead losing them to frost damage and just the leaves falling off because they're killed that way. They also produce tons of fruit, which of course can be dispersed by birds and other animals. And they are very tolerant of deer browsing and pruning, which is part of the reason why they were very good hedges, right? And all these characteristics mean that they were fantastic hedges and very popular and sold throughout the country for this reason. But when translated into a natural system, those traits allow these plants to quickly dominate their host systems and exclude native plants and animals as a consequence of that. And so these traits are not only the reason why buckthorn is invasive, but also a very important part of how it's invasive and how we have to manage it, right? This is the problem that we have to deal with. And buckthorn has a whole lot of diverse impacts on the ecosystems that it invades. This is the why we have to manage it, right? It excludes native plants, and as a consequence of that, it arrests forest succession. So we don't have little trees turning into big trees. We don't have new species coming in. That's just a perpetual cycle of buckthorn. That has real economic consequences for things like timber production, especially in northern parts of Minnesota, where timber production is a massive industry. The impacts of buckthorn can be a substantial economic influence. We have things like reduced habitat and forage quality for wildlife, so reducing the types and abundances of animals that we see in buckthorn invaded areas. We see altered nutrient and fire dynamics. There's the types of leaves that buckthorn drops decompose really quickly. They don't provide opportunities for fire to go through. This changes the way that litter layers decompose on the forest floor, and also means that we get increased erosion and lower water quality in watersheds invaded by buckthorn. And all of this is within a context too of positive feedback loops with earthworms. Earthworms make habitats more suitable for buckthorn, and buckthorn makes habitats more suitable for earthworms. And so we have this really messy, really messy web of impacts. Other impacts in the economic sector include things like soybean aphids and oak crown rust. Buckthorn is a host for both of those pests and pathogens, and those can have direct impacts on yield, farmers' yields and their livelihoods, as well as food security. And then finally, buckthorn also just kind of makes forests not very fun or useful for us as people. And so, yeah, there's a whole web of impacts that we have to deal with. And for these reasons, many of which many of you already know, right? Like a lot of that I'm not shocking anyone with. That's but just to make the point, there's a lot going on here, right? And so we have lots of different reasons why we want to remove buckthorn and why we want to manage buckthorn and how we want to push these systems to not have those traits, but instead have the traits of healthy, diverse, highly functional native communities. And so because of this, we have lots of drive to remove and manage buckthorn. And there's lots of different ways that we can do that. There's many different tools that we can use. So for example, most types of buckthorn removal include a physical removal of some sort, a mechanical removal of some part. And that can take the form of uprooting plants, right? That's really the only way to guarantee that the plant actually dies, is to rip it out of the ground. But we can also do things like cutting the plant, whether by hand or machine, and that's often paired with herbicide in order to help reduce chances of resprouts. Or maybe we have like really industrial methodologies as well, things like forestry mowers that can go through and clear large swaths of land very quickly. All of these are often paired with some sort of follow-up tool, maybe in really open areas like more grassland savanna type systems we can get fire through, although in most woodland systems that's not an option for a variety of reasons, including some of those ecological impacts I mentioned a moment ago. There's increasing interest in using things like livestock to manage buckthorn, things like goats, for example. And chemical herbicides are also a reliable source of follow-up control as well. One thing that we've been looking at more recently is this idea of critical period cutting. And so this is a methodology that basically aims to deplete the carbon reserves, or basically use up the sugars that are inside the plant and stress it through repeated cutting. And the way that this works is we high top the plants in June. So instead of cutting them down at the ground, we cut them at basically chest height, and strip any regrowth that comes off that plant again in September, and then again the following June and the September after that. So at least three different stripping events after that initial management. And we've been looking at this in the context of Minnesota woodlands, especially, where we've looked at a bunch of different stems, hundreds of stems across different parts of Minnesota, different contexts, different sizes, different canopies. And we've implemented this cutting strategy. And by the end of the second summer, which was this past summer, or this now, basically, we've had about 3/4 of the plants die. And we're not sure we haven't done the analysis yet to figure out if this is, tied to a particular size class or environmental condition, right? Or, how are those things influencing it? But broadly speaking, we have really high mortality in Minnesota. We're also doing this in partnership with researchers in a handful of other states in the Eastern United States. And those sites too seem to be showing some of the same results. This is all really preliminary stuff, but we're seeing this approach work. And we have anecdotal evidence from our partners that they've been able to implement it in the field effectively. And so this is a low disturbance and non-chemical management option that might be increasingly interesting to people that either don't want to use herbicides or can't for various reasons, including places where herbicide use is prohibited by ordinance or legislation. And so this is the type of activity that can work really well for volunteers, for example, for like if you have friends of park organizations or local community groups, Cub Scouts, they can do this work really effectively. And it requires really minimal equipment and training too, right? All you have to be able to do is pull these soft green tissues off of a stick, and it works. And just to give a little bit more context about why this works. So like the way that trees, including buckthorn, often go through the winter is that they come through winter with some sugar stored in their stem and roots, right? They've been using that sugar to survive over the winter, and coming into spring, they're going to use that sugar to produce new growth, put out new leaves, and so they're going to kind of draw this sugar battery down in the spring. But over the course of summer, because it's warm and sunny and there's rain, these plants are able to photosynthesize and produce new sugar and fill that battery back up. So by the time we get to fall, their battery is more or less full again. And so this is how plants deal with their energy reserves over the course of a year. But with critical period cutting, we flip the script a little bit, right? We go from a situation where their carbon gains are less than their carbon outputs to a situation where their carbon outputs are greater than their carbon gains. And so basically plants are spending more carbon, more sugar than they have. And so coming out of spring here, we're dealing with plants that, yes, have some reserves. They mobilize that reserve in order to grow a little bit. But then when we high top them in June, that's going to prevent them from recharging that battery as effectively. And so we continually steal that carbon back. They might be able to grow back a little bit, right? Or a lot actually. But still, we're going to steal that back. We're going to steal all that investment that they put and prevent them from recouping their carbon expenditures. And eventually, if we keep doing that in June and September, right, that's going to eventually drive them to the point where they just don't have enough carbon to live. And that's what we saw, right? We saw that about 3/4 of the plants across this wide gradient of size and conditions ended up dying because of this approach just within 2 years. Oop. Oh, where did they go? There we go. All right. So whether you're using critical period cutting or a more conventional approach, no matter what, removal efforts are almost always incomplete, right? We have multiple different ways that buckthorn persists in our landscapes despite our best efforts. One is through resprouts, right? We have these damaged stems that are going to put out new growth. And buckthorn often is a plant where I think about it like a mythological hydra, where you cut off one stem and you get 10 stems in its place. And this is a problem that shows up very regularly in any type of mechanical removal, but especially those that don't involve herbicide use, right? And so we have to deal with these resprouts that in a lot of cases make the problem worse. But we also have other ways that buckthorn persists, right? There's small buckthorn that escape treatment. So plants that either we intentionally didn't treat, for example, if we create a management plan and we say, we're gonna treat all the buckthorn that are taller than 3 feet tall. That leaves all those little guys behind on purpose, right? But even if we write them into the management plan, we're human, we're gonna miss plants. There's gonna be things that we just don't recognize or we miss or don't get treated effectively with herbicide or whatever it is, right? There's just gonna be plants that escape treatment. But there's also new plants. There's new plants that show up from the seed that gets dispersed as we pull out their parents, right? Their brothers and sisters from around them. As we pull those fruiting trees out of the forest, those seeds get dispersed. And so those seeds will germinate and create new plants. And then there's new seeds that could come from outside as well, right? If birds fly in, they can reintroduce buckthorn that way as well. And so we have these 3 different mechanisms by which buckthorn tends to persist on a landscape, even despite our best management efforts. And so almost every buckthorn invasion that gets managed needs to be managed again. This is a site in Marine St. Croix in Minnesota here. This is my research partner, Peter Raig, who started the project with me back in 2016. And you can see that all around him, there's plenty of vegetation, right? And most of that vegetation is buckthorn that's resprouted and regrown in just a couple of years. And so very quickly these systems can, go from what might look to be a managed or controlled state to something that's completely dominated by buckthorn once again. And that means that we have to go back in there and do management again and again and again. We're never really moving the needle, right? And the biggest reason for this is those resprouts, right? Those resprouts are the immediate challenge. This is another example. So this is a site down in Victoria, Minnesota, where I'm holding a resprout of a Moab, a mother of all buckthorn, a giant buckthorn stem that's resprouted, and it's already 6 feet tall. Just a couple months after treatment. That's how much sugar is stored in the roots of this massive tree. And so it's able to mobilize that sugar very effectively to regrow. And there's nothing that we could do. There's nothing that we could put into that system that would be able to compete with that, right? Those resprouts will redominate the system very easily because they just have so much growth potential. And so we need to deal with them if we have any hope of changing the structure or composition of the system. And there's multiple ways that we can do that. The most reliable is through herbicide use, right? So we can do a foliar spray on these stems and knock them back down. We've had really good results using herbicide called phosphine ammonium, krenite. But a more conventional herbicide would be something like triclopyr, like Garlon, would be a more conventional foliar herbicide, and both of those are effective at suppressing buckthorn when applied as a foliar spray. You could also do repeated mechanical removal, and this really gets more into the realm of critical period cutting, where we're just trying to exhaust the plant over multiple passes over multiple years. But in order to be effective, that really does have to, that really has to be something where we're trying to stress the plant repeatedly. It can't be something where we, mow once and then come back 2 years later and mow again. That's not going to stress the plant. The plant's going to be fine. It has to be really persistent. And so let's say we have those resprouts under control, at least to some extent, right? We're able to knock back the majority of the resprouts. That leaves all the little guys behind, right? Those little guys, the ones that we left behind, the new ones that are showing up from seed, those are the plants that in some ways present a little bit more sinister problem, right? They're harder to spot, they're harder to see literally in the woodland because they're small, but they're also easy to dismiss because they're small. But they're the things that really are pressuring the system over the next 5, 6, 10 years or whatever, right? These are the ones that are going to be the longer term problem. And unfortunately, by doing the management that we've already done, we've kind of set the stage for these little guys' success. We've created an environment that is resource rich for them. If you look at this top picture here, there's a very familiar case here where this is a property line. And on the left, the property owner has not managed buckthorn. And on the right, the property owner has managed buckthorn. And you can see that those are very different conditions, not just in terms of the number of plants, but also in the types of resources that are available to little baby buckthorn that are showing up in either of those sides of the property line. Right on the left, a little baby buckthorn is going to have really high competition from its neighbors and have very low access to things like light. Whereas on the right, there's tons of light. There's very little competition. All the resources that this little baby buckthorn on the right needs are there for it. And so when we do management like this, we actually move systems in a way that provide those extra resources. Down here is a graph that shows some of the early work that we did looking at buckthorn survival rates relative to light availability. And so on the y-axis, we have the 3-year survival rate, and on the x-axis, we have canopy openness, which is basically, if you look up in the sky, how much light do you see as a proportion? And what you see here is that above 10%, buckthorn doesn't really care. It's good. It has more than 10% light, buckthorn is happy. Below 10%, it starts to feel the pain a little bit, but really I got to get down to like 2-3% light availability for buckthorn to have substantially reduced survival rates. And it turns out that in these intact buckthorn stands, that's where we're at. We're at this like 2 to 3% light availability in intact buckthorn stands generally. But by removing that buckthorn, we have removed that competition and catapulted these systems not from 2 to 3% light availability, but up to like 20% light availability, where buckthorn has a really good time. And so these little baby buckthorn are able to exploit this resource boon and experience much higher rates of survival, much faster growth, and they will retake the system if left alone. This is especially the case because there's very few native species that are left after years of invasion to compete against them. So we have a situation where there's lots of resources and only buckthorn to use it. And so buckthorn will use it. It will take back over. But what my work has shown, and the work of my collaborators, has been that reestablishing native species, getting them back into the fight, takes a big chunk out of this problem. Right? Reestablishing native species can help reduce invasion by exerting competition in the years where buckthorn are smallest and most vulnerable. And we've done this, like I said, for almost a decade now. And we've been looking at a bunch of different experiments in a bunch of different contexts with a bunch of different methods. And across that diversity of contexts, we see very reliable results, although the exact magnitude is variable depending on case-by-case scenarios. But we see reliable impacts of reestablishing native species on suppressing buckthorn invasion. And that's somewhere in the range of 50 to 90% reduction in invasion, depending on the context. And so that's using things like wild rye grasses to reestablish dense cover, or planting shrub species like red elderberry to shade out buckthorn. Right? Both of these are some of our flagship species that we look to as really good examples of how this method can work. And the reason why these species work is because they exert competition in the shoulder seasons, primarily in the fall. So that study that we did looking at light sensitivity of buckthorn also broke down light availability based on season. And the thing about buckthorn, like I mentioned at the beginning, was that it keeps its leaves late, right? If we look outside right now, there's plenty of buckthorn out there that's green, has its leaves on, and if it's warm enough, we'll be photosynthesizing. And that right there is one of the keys to buckthorn success. So if we look at the probability of survival relative to light availability in the summer, buckthorn really is indifferent. It doesn't matter very much how much light it has in the summer. What matters is how much light it has in the fall, right? That shading in this time of year in particular has a major impact on how much carbon, how much sugar that plant is able to produce in the fall, and therefore how likely it is to survive through the winter and to the next summer. And so plants that can compete against buckthorn this time of year in the fall, they are the ones that are best able to mitigate this advantage that buckthorn has and basically turn the superpower into a weakness. And things like wild rye grasses are able to do this because they produce this thatchy layer that shades in the fall. Right? There's a layer of grasses that persists. Even if it's not green, it's still shading little buckthorn. And so things like wild rye grasses can do this effectively. But in order to do that, they need to be present, right? And they need to be present very quickly. 99% of buckthorn seedlings will germinate within 2 years of dispersal. So that's kind of the window that we're working in, is that 2 years after dispersal, or really after management at this point, because that's often the thing that is releasing the seeds. 2 years after that management, you have to have dense cover established. And that's unfortunate because oftentimes that's the time when ambient cover is lowest. That's the time when there's the fewest volunteer species available to produce that cover. And so that's the challenge. That's the need that we have to meet with our revegetation strategies, is filling that void when that void is, most glaring. This is also the time when buckthorn is weakest. Looking at buckthorn survival rates year over year, they have the greatest chance of dying in their first year, and then a little bit lower, a little bit higher, a little bit higher chances of surviving in their second year. But then by the third year, they're pretty much good. So 3-year-old seedlings are very robust to competition. And so we need to compete against them in those first 2 years of life if we're going to have a good shot of killing them. After they get 3 years old, they're pretty tolerant of competition, and so are much less likely to die. And so this means that we need to have really dense cover established in the summer following management. If we're doing management, in the winter time, if we're getting a forestry mower out there cutting down buckthorn in the middle of winter, that following summer, we need to have a nice dense layer of vegetation present if we're going to keep the buckthorn down. And so we can do this through things like winter seeding. We've done almost all of our experiments by hand seeding in winter. That has a couple benefits. One is that it makes sure that it gives you an opportunity to ensure adequate coverage, right? So if you're seeding on top of snow, for example, you have a good visual indicator of where seeds are and where they are not. And so you can have better coverage that way. You also have some benefits with ensuring proper stratification for species that need to be stratified, and also with snowmelt, allowing for good seed soil contact and soil moisture at the time when it's most needed. So winter seeding has worked out really well for us. For planting things like shrubs, right? We're not going to be planting those in the middle of winter, but we can do that early in the spring as a way to give those plants the most opportunity to establish as possible. And so both of these are things that are labor intensive, but also very accessible for volunteer groups. Sally Manzara Nature Center in Lake Elmo, Minnesota is a really great example of this. They have a forest restoration project right now where they have regular volunteer opportunities for community members to come out and spread native plant seed in their buckthorn removal areas. And this includes even small children, right? Like they can do this. You probably want to have supervision, but they can do it. With planting, probably not going to be leaving that up to small children, but older people can do planting as well. This is a picture of a group of college students that I led doing a restoration planning a couple years ago. So again, another great volunteer opportunity. And so seeding grasses is probably one of the more accessible ways that we do this. These are very practical and cost-effective ways that you can get kind of canned commercial mixes that are intended for revegetation against buckthorn, but you can also build your own mix, right? No one's stopping you from grabbing a bunch of seed and putting it together in your own bespoke mixture. And so regardless of where you're getting your seed from, this can be a very cost-effective way to revegetate your properties. Primarily, we're looking at species like Canada, Virginia, and silky wild rye as being the species that offer the most bang for your buck. They are adapted for woodlands that have, let's say more than 10% canopy openness. So they're very well suited for the types of environments that buckthorn tends to invade. They're very fast growing, and they leave that thatchy layer that I was talking about before. And so this is a picture in the first or second year of a management that, no, it must be the first year. Sorry. It's the first year after management in that Marine on St. Croix site. And so on the left, we've seeded the wild rye grasses in, and on the right, we haven't. And so you see how different the coverage is between these two conditions, that the wild ryegrasses, again, have produced really dense cover here, whereas on the right, there's very low cover and lots of light available for new buckthorn to use. And this is seeding that we're doing at about 600 seeds per square meter of grasses. And this seeding has accumulating impacts over time. So this is a graph showing the cumulative growth per seedling. So, for however many buckthorn seedlings we start out with, how much biomass, how much growth we get out of those seedlings over time. And so it's kind of a generalized metric of invasion. And we have this for multiple cohorts of buckthorn, so buckthorn arising in different years and monitored over time. And so you see the 2018 cohort in green, the 2019 cohort in red, the 2020 in blue, the 2021 in gray, and then those cohorts that are showing up in either unseeded plots in the open bars or in seeded plots, which are the green bars. And you can see that over time, right? And what I want you to notice, there's a lot going on here, but I want you to notice is that the difference between the open bars and the closed bars gets bigger over time, right? Especially for that 2018 and 2019 cohorts, the green and the red bars, the difference between the open and closed ones gets bigger over time. And so by the end of this particular study, which was 2022, there was a 65% reduction in buckthorn cumulative growth from the 2018 cohort, and a 77% reduction in cumulative growth of buckthorn from the 2019 cohort. So those are substantial reductions in the size and abundance of buckthorn over time. And this is particularly true for buckthorn that are showing up early in the management timeline, right? These are the buckthorn that are showing up right after management, and those are the buckthorn that are most strongly influenced by seeding. But that's good because that's also the time when we need seeding the most. That's the time that when those buckthorn are going to be most abundant and going to be most likely to succeed in the absence of seeding. But these seeding effects are not ubiquitous. They're not the same everywhere. One of the biggest things that it depends on is canopy openness. And so both these graphs have canopy openness, again, the amount of light that you see if you look up on the x-axis, and then on the left you see herbaceous cover, and on the right you see ground level light availability, basically how much light makes it down to the soil surface. And in both these cases you can see that seeding substantially increases the amount of cover, therefore reducing the amount of light, but that this is most pronounced in more open sites that have sparser canopies, because those sparser canopies allow for those grasses to establish more densely. And so this has corresponding impacts on buckthorn growth and survival. Again, canopy openness is here on the x-axis, and then that cumulative growth metric is on the y-axis, on the vertical axis, with seeded in green and unseeded plots in black here. And you'll see that the greatest impact on buckthorn survival is in those brighter sites. So for example, a 20% canopy openness site, which might look something like this hemispherical photo, right? On average, we're seeing a 90% reduction in buckthorn survival there, because those are places where we're able to generate really dense grass cover. Whereas a site that has 70% or 7% openness, we're seeing a lesser impact, something closer to a 60% reduction in buckthorn invasion. Still really good, but it's not 90%, right? So we get, robust results out of this, but they're the greatest in those more open sites where we can more densely establish grasses. And this is supported by the work that our partners in our Citizen Science Network have done. So we did a Citizen Science Network Across the state of Minnesota, a bunch of different places that were invaded by buckthorn, close to 100 different participants, and they replicated this experiment all across the state. So it's not just the sites that we're managing, it's the sites that they're managing, and they found virtually the same results. And so this isn't just something that we can do under relatively controlled experimental conditions. It's something that real people can do in real places. And that these, yes. And we don't have to just stop at grasses, right? We can include wildflowers in these as well. After about 5 years, the grasses do start to thin out. And so incorporating wildflowers into our seed mixes can be a really good way of improving the long-term value of these seed mixes and allowing those communities to naturally succeed into a more forb-dominated state. Species like white snakeroot, rudbeckia, waterleaf, bee balm, these are all species that we've worked into our seed mix and that have done really well in a diversity of sites. We also, if we're thinking about this as being something that's reliant on canopy openness, two major things that are going on right now, at least in my neck of the woods, is emerald ash borer and oak wilt. And I know many of you are past the point of no return for ash borer, but nonetheless, these are both major forest disturbances that are opening up the canopy. And in both of these scenarios, these are both a risk and an opportunity for more effective management, right? By opening the canopy, by thinning the canopy, these sites are likely more vulnerable to invasion, but could also allow more effective establishment of native species, right? Because we saw that those grasses do better in those more open sites. Maybe this is an opportunity for us to get those species in there and prevent buckthorn from coming in and replacing those dead ash and oak trees. And if we do that, we not only get reductions in invasion, we get a whole bunch of knock-on effects too, right? We have things like improved pollinator habitat. I have a postdoc, Mark Fuka, that's doing a paper right now looking at how pollinator habitat, especially for things like rusty patch bumblebee, is affected by these seeding treatments. We also see things like stabilized nutrient cycling. An undergraduate student of mine, Kara Lamoureux, did a project looking at litter decomposition, how these restored systems have more stable nutrient cycling and decomposition processes. And so there's all sorts of add-on effects that we get. But if that's not the case, right, if we're not dealing with these brighter sites, if we're dealing with these darker sites, we might want to include some woody species. Woody species are generally going to be better adapted for those darker conditions, at least some woody species are going to be. And they can be better competitors against buckthorn because of their structural similarities. For example, things like elderberry or evergreens are going to exert competition in that late fall when buckthorn is most in need of sunlight, right? And so elderberry, evergreens both hold their leaves either late into the fall or year round in the case of evergreens. And so this can be an asset for them in use for this application. But since we're planting individual trees, they have a limited zone of influence, right? These individual stems can only affect the plants that are directly around them. It's not like we're seeding where we get, tons and tons of individuals. We're dealing with a relatively small number of individuals and they can only influence things directly around them. And so we need to plant at really high densities for these plantings to be effective. And we need to protect them against things like deer that are going to knock them back. And so we're looking at like exactly how dense we have to plant these in a collaboration with Shakopee, Mawakon, and Sioux community, and try and figure out like what's the minimum threshold that we can do. Seems so far like the denser the better is the answer so far. But because we have a limited capacity to plant individual stems, we probably want to fill in the interstitial area with something else, right? And we can use woody plant seed to fill the gap. We can use grass seed to fill the gap. But either way, we want to make sure that there's something in between these individuals that we plant. But of course, especially with woody species, sourcing is going to be a challenge. And so things like seed collection programs are going to be an asset there. But if we can generate kind of a continuous layer of woody recruitment, there could be some safety in numbers there. So this is a picture of an experiment that we have in Circle Pines, Minnesota, where we seeded in a bunch of native woody species, things like elderberry and ribes and dogwoods and cherries. And all these plants are growing up in concert with each other. And so when a deer comes in, it doesn't eat everything down to the ground. It eats everything, it kind of spreads out the damage a little bit, as opposed to having just one plant that's going to just totally get obliterated. So I think there's some safety in numbers here if we can get this kind of blanket reestablishment. And we don't have to do all the heavy lifting ourselves. We can rely on natural recruitment to do some of the hard work for us too. Often black cherry, for example, co-occurs with buckthorn. And so there might be black cherry resprouts or black cherry seedlings that occur in these buckthorn management areas, and they can contribute to the stem count and cover density that we need. They can kind of improve the baseline conditions that we have to work on, so we don't have to plant or seed as much. And this is an experiment that we have out in Lake Elmo, Minnesota, looking at these different combinations and densities of plantings. And what we found there was that really the most important thing is the number of native stems. The more native stems you have, the less buckthorn you have. It doesn't matter if it was stems that we planted or stems that we didn't plant, but competition was the thing that was most important. And so if we have systems that have an ambient amount of recruitment on their own, we can augment that, we can add on top of that, and hopefully that means that we have to do a little less work to help keep the buckthorn out. Now, whether we're seeding or planting, whatever our management is, we still need to do some follow-up. Right? This is not a silver bullet. There will always be individuals that make it through, but with good monitoring and a little bit of luck, having far fewer plants that are weaker combined with this ongoing vigilance, we can push communities in the right direction. And so one thing that we see working very well in conjunction with things like grass seeding is controlled burns, right? These are systems that maybe otherwise couldn't support fire, but now that we've reestablished a grass layer, there's this continuous fine fuel layer that we can set on fire and burn and can kill really small buckthorn, right? Which are more likely because the buckthorn that survive are going to be fewer and smaller. So we're doing the 1-2 punch on this thing, right? There's fewer buckthorn, they're smaller, and we're providing opportunity to set them on fire. That's a win. And so we can use things like prescribed fire in those systems. We can also use other follow-up methods like critical period cutting or triclopyr to do foliar spraying after the fact and target buckthorn specifically. Triclopyr is generally safe for grasses, and so you could spray it on the buckthorn and not have as much non-target impacts on the grasses as you might if you sprayed a less specific chemical. So both of those are viable follow-up methods that would work well with this type of revegetation seeding. Right. So in a nutshell, right, establishing native species quickly after initial management can reduce the amount of buckthorn returning over multiple years. Things like wild rise and wildflowers do really well in more open sites, whereas planting shrubs like elderberry are going to be better for those darker sites. If you have questions, you can always email me or check out our website. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Mike. Really, really appreciate it. And actually, if you wouldn't mind, would you just share that screen one more time with your with your email, because we had a ton of questions and there is no way that we will be able to get to all of them.
Yeah, sorry, went a little long on that, but
that is okay. There was so much good info. I didn't want to stop you, but yes, thank you, Bob, for sharing Mike's email in the chat, and also encourage everybody to visit the website there, coveritup.umn.edu, to answer any questions that you may have, and then also following up with Mike if if any of your questions are not answered there. I think I will just go to one question that is very broad and that came up a few different times, which is, does all of this that you've been talking about also apply to Frangula alnus, or is this specific to the certain type of buckthorn that we were talking about? You could just give a very broad overview, like if you're seeing similarities or significant differences between the two.
Right. Yeah. So a lot of the concepts are the same. I think the thing that is going to differ is not the plant but the context. And so we've done experiments where we've put Frangula alnus into these plots and it behaves very similarly. Right. So I don't think it's a difference in the plant susceptibility. I think it's, if there is a difference in the application, it's that some sites are going to be more responsive to this type of management than others. And it's not the buckthorn, it's the water and the soil and the light conditions that are going to influence that.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Well, thank you again so much, Mike. Really appreciate it. Lots of good information, excellent turnout. Thank you, everybody, for your thoughtful comments and questions. Please do reach out to Mike if you have any questions that were not answered here. And with that, I would like to take us through our final slides here. So here, give me 1 second. Okay. So with that, we encourage you to become a regular with our webcasts. They are on the second Wednesday of every month in the Eastern Time Zone's noon hour. So you can find our upcoming webcasts as long as our recordings from previous webcasts at stewardshipnetwork.org/webcasts. We'd like to talk about a few of the ones we've got coming up. So in December of 2025, we have Cultivating Conservation Capacity, Growth and Change at the Kalamazoo Nature Center. That's with Jessica Simmons of the Kalamazoo Nature Center. Then in January 2026, we have Ecology of Red-Headed Woodpeckers in a Threatened Ecosystem, Insights from a Long-Term Investigation in Oak Savannas. That's with Elena West of the University of Minnesota, Twin Cities. And in February of 2026, we have Slow and Steady Wins the Race, Conserving Blanding's Turtles Through Science and Stewardship. That's with Yu Man Lee of the Michigan Natural Features Inventory. With that, thank you all so much. Another wonderful edition of Stewardship Network's monthly webcasts. Again, my name is Rob Buzinski, and I hope you have a wonderful rest of the day and rest of the week. Take care.